הדובר השני שלנו במושב, פרופסור שאול סוסנובסקי ממרילנד. עיקר התמחותו זה בעיסוק של ספרות ואתיקה לטינית, אבל אנחנו כאן עוסקים בדבר היותר חשוב של ההתמחות שלו, שזה בורכס והקבלה. ופרופסור סוסנובסקי ייתן הרצאה, בורכס and the Kabbalah, Trust in Words.
קודם כל אני צריך להתנצל על שאדבר בשפה הלא נכונה. בספרדית. אני פשוט לא מסוגל לנאום בעברית, עדיין לא. Borges and the Kabbalah, Trust in Words, with gratitude for the invitation. Let me start with a quotation from Borges. I was very interested in mysticism even though I am not a believer. So I have read books on Kabbalah just as I have read books on Sufism or as I have read the work of Swedenborg. Borges' treatment of Kabbalistic motifs has been the subject of a few books and of a greater number of articles. A first reference can be found in 1964, a text signed by Rabbi, Stam Rabbi. We don't know any more about him. Later on, using varying approaches that nevertheless covered familiar ground, Chaim El-Asraki, Edna Eisenberg, and I, among others, published essays devoted to this subject. Such attention was inevitable, given Borges' explicit interest in the subject, particularly as he stated in his 1932 text, A Vindication of the Kabbalah, and in the Kabbalah, a lecture that was subsequently published in Siete Noches, 7 Nights. References to Jewish beliefs and traditions, moreover, are sprinkled throughout his work. In the 1930s and 1940s, his sustained condemnation of fascist creeds and Nazi atrocities also found their way in his fiction. Years later, his admiration for Israel was to be crafted in poetry. Certainly in Jewish traditions, reading into text is not a novel exercise. As a very young student in Jerusalem, I learned from the Chabad Leibovich Zal to inquire not just into what Rashi stated, but also into his silences. While I certainly do not equate the text that Rashi interrogated and enlightened with Borges' fictions, I do think that more than many others, his texts, Borges' texts, provoke a critical exercise and seduce us into peeling away the layer of the explicit and literal in search of something else, of some connection to whatever we as readers may fathom. Different kernels, different secrets, radically different notions and theological beliefs and devotions separate the sacred from the classic, the reading of the God-given from the writer's arbitrary play with words. And still, though far from the Kabbalist commitment to approach the Creator, in a heterodox vein, Borges sought to bond author and reader. His first book, the 1923 Fervor de Buenos Aires, opens with apologetic words that serve as a cautionary invitation and also pose a challenge. He wrote, "To whoever may read this, if the pages of this book consent to produce a fortunate verse, forgive me the discourtesy of having usurped it in advance. Our nothingness, nuestras nadas, differ little. It is trivial and fortuitous that you be the reader of these exercises and I their editor." Borges uses the word redactor, which in this case conveys composer or craftsman. While these curious lines would go against any belief that sustains the primacy of an author text, they nevertheless accentuate the primordial significance of the written word and the challenge it poses to the reader. The subtext conveys the very notion of a shared language. Uncovering it is thrust upon the reader. In other literary exercises, and against any claim to copyright, Borges underscored that a good verse belongs to no one but to tradition. I stress what Borges wrote as he embarked on the rediscovery of his own city. He had spent a few years in Europe, of its streets, of its home, and self after having spent several years in Europe, not just because he often stated that subsequent pages drew from what his seminal book intimated, but because he has cast language as the principal tool to address the questions that continue to unsettle every philosophical system. In so doing, he also reneged of novelty, of the cult of facile experimental innovation, in which he himself engaged while in Spain, opting instead for tradition, for what was and still is, for rereading and interpreting the readily available as well as the hidden language. While Borges frequented any number of symbols drawn from established religions, traditions, myths, and sources, both real as well as those he himself invented and used for further elucidation, and in so doing he confused the literal reader, it is words that anchor every search for meaning. I believe this to be the core linkage to his fascination with the Kabbalah, along with the desire to understand what lies behind the Kabbalist use of hermeneutic and cryptographic procedures, which he mentions in A Vindication of the Kabbalah, which has been traduced, I think, perhaps not rightly, as a defense of Kabbalah. Vindications and defenses are two different things. Borges has repeatedly dispelled any exclusive or singularly preferential allegiance to Judaism, which would explain why, before getting to the Kabbalah's vindication, he appealed to Quranic notions. He quoted Bacon and John Donne and found the Trinity, I quote, a case of intellectual teratology, a monster which only the horror of a nightmare could spawn. Considering theology a branch of fantastic literature, has allowed him to dismiss any and all affiliations, though in a number of texts he often expressed a certain affinity with Buddhism. To finally get to the Torah, what he called a deliberate writing by an infinite intelligence, he cuts a swath through poetry and through prose to conclude about the scriptures that the Kabbalists pour over the following: a book impervious to contingencies, a mechanism of infinite purposes, of infallible variations, of revelations lying in wait, of superimpositions of light. How could one not study it to absurdity, to numerical excess, as did the Kabbalah? Borges' lecture on the Kabbalah followed a similar path, pointing out the difference between sacred and classic, and he has a quote that is worth remembering in a text called Sobre los Clásicos, on the classics. He says, "Classic is not a book, I repeat," his words, "not that necessarily possess such or such merits. It is a book that generations urged by diverse reasons read with previous fervor and with a mysterious loyalty." I return. Borges' lecture on the Kabbalah followed a similar path. Pointing out the difference between sacred and classic, he moved on to oral versus written, from the Greeks to the Quran, and finally to the Kabbalists' strange science, his words, that holds the Torah to be a sacred book. I quote, "The Holy Spirit," he writes, has condescended to literature, which is as incredible as imagining that God condescended to become a man. In that book, nothing can be accidental. In human writing, there is always something accidental. Having dispatched Judaism and Christianity in one sentence, he proceeded to exemplify several cryptographic devices to allude to Sefirot, to the Adam Kadmon. As he navigated along established topoi, almost in passing, Borges offered what I think he values the most of the Kabbalah. He says, I am not dealing with a museum piece from the history of philosophy. I believe the system has an application. It can serve as a means of thinking, of trying to understand the universe. This led him to consider the problem of evil by referring to sources ranging from Eob to Spinoza to Schopenhauer to Leibniz to Kierkegaard to George Bernard Shaw to Wells and finally to Gustav Meyrink and to Gershom Scholem, he's called there, account of the golem. He has a poem to which I will refer called The Golem, and he of course uses the word Sholem as the only appropriate rhyme. I'm sure he wouldn't have approved of that, but in a poem called The Compass, in a book called El Otro, El Mismo, Borges wrote, behind the name there is something that cannot be named. In his lecture, he retrieved from the divine the human dimension. And he said, in each of us there is a particle of divinity. The world evidently cannot be the work of an all-powerful and just God, but it depends on us. This is the lesson the Kabbalah gives us, beyond being a curiosity studied by historians and grammarians. In a 1980 interview with Jaime Al-Azraqi, Borges said, I find a very interesting idea in the Kabbalah, an idea also found in Carlyle and Leon Blois. It is the idea that the whole world is merely a system of symbols, that the whole world, including the stars, stood for God's secret writing. That idea is to be found in the Kabbalah, and I think that may be my chief attraction to it. The Golem is the title of one of his most cherished poems, his best, he said in my first interview with him, as well as of a lengthier explanation in his Manual de Zoología Fantástica that includes quotes from the Talmud, Sanhedrin 65b from Gustav Meyrink's novel, a reference to Eleazar of Worms' preservation of the formula to build a golem, and a footnote from Schopenhauer. The golem struck Borges not so much for Jewish Prague's historical context, but for his magical power of utterances that grant life and bestow death. Also, by the parallel attitude of both God and Rabbi Lev upon contemplating their respective disappointing creations. In so doing, the poet shields the creator from his product's imperfections. This formula is further developed by Borges in the story La Escritura del Dios, the God's script, the only story he said in pre-Hispanic Mexico, in fact, the only pre-Hispanic story he ever wrote. In it, Tzinakan, the magician priest of the pyramid of Kaholom perhaps as Kaolam, having been tortured to reveal the secret location of Moctezuma's treasures, wails away his time in a deep, dark cell. To fill time's void, he manages to retrieve a hidden formula of 14 words, 40 syllables, number 4 again, that the God inscribed on the first day of creation to ward off the evils that would befall the world at the end of time, obviously a reference to Acharita Yamim. Through laborious deductions aimed at unveiling the secret dictum, Tzinakan reached a workable conclusion. He says, A God, I reflected, must speak but a single word, and in that word must be absolute plenitude. No word uttered by a God could be less than the universe or briefer than the sum of time. The ultimate revelation to Tzinakan comes to him, however, not by reaching towards the heavens nor to godlike attributes, but by accepting reality. He was nothing but a prisoner. It is the acknowledgement of his own human misery that allowed, and I quote, union with the deity, union with the universe. Having obtained a formula that would grant him omnipotence, he cries out, "Oh, joy of understanding, greater than the joy of imagining, greater than the joy of feeling." Contrary to mundane expectations, remember, this is a priest, a magician, he refrained from uttering it. For having been granted a godlike power, he has ceased to be who he was. Beyond dwelling on similarities of Tzinakan's path with Kabbalistic motifs, his ultimate decision merits further consideration. In the first place, is accepting the preeminence of the human over the godlike. The divine may cast a path of light, but it is up to the man to know, accept, and remain within human parameters. The formula Tzinakan recognized on the tiger's hide defied all language, including his own, for that was the nature of a formula to ward off the end of time. Furthermore, as Borges has shown in several texts, there is a moment in life when every human being learns and acknowledges who he is. Hay un momento en la vida de cada hombre en que uno sabe para siempre quién es. A life's lesson.
In the end of time.
Which is the same as the beginning. Oh, plenty of time. Speaking of time. Un momento. Therefore, when granted a boundless power, but at the price of foregoing his individual identity, Tzinakan opts for remaining a prisoner. Second, by keeping silent, by not turning back or casting humanity out of this forward flow, he commits to historical continuity. In the context of today's reading, moreover, Borges emphasizes understanding vis-a-vis imagining and feeling, precisely two of the venues a devoted believer would pursue in serving God and in the path to uncover the secrets of creation. Borges toys with magic, and even with desire, but ultimately he strives for literary closure of established texts. He seeks reasoned arguments, be they of Kabbalistic exercises or of historical events. Two such cases are Deutsches Requiem, attempting to understand Germany's perverse enterprise, and Tlon, Ukbar Orbis Tertius, anticipating what might have occurred had Germany won the war. That's the opening text of the book Ficciones. Throughout his work, Borges exalted reason and understanding as driving forces for any phenomenon, including the imaginary. Having consulted Eric Bischof's Die Elemente der Kabbalah and Jan Peter Stehlin's Rabbinical Literatures, a 1748 book, Borges wrote in a 1926 essay titled A Story of Angels the following: "It is evident that those who accuse the Kabbalists of vagueness are thoroughly mistaken. They were rather fanatics of reason and dreamed up a world made of deification by installments, which was, however, as logical, as rigorous, and as causality-driven as the one we now feel." End of quote. While his use of such sources may be questioned, in my interview with him, he considered Bischof's book to be pretty bad. What is noteworthy is his exaltation not of faith, but of imagination, but of reason as humanity's prime inquiry tool. Literature, as all art, anticipates what will be. Borges' texts do so by probing not solely into texts, but also on how they have been and may continue to be read. They seek sources and also plot the navigation towards them by asking whys and wherefores. By his own admission, a hedonic reader, Borges always focused on texts, whether real or not, and on his craft's intellectual dimension. The Jorge Luis Borges collection, housed in Argentina's National Library, offers a unique glimpse into such claims and into some of the sources that informed his interest into Jewish traditions, history, and Kabbalah. As the collection's editors continue to review materials and expand their cross-references and meticulously brilliant notations, this being just one of the libraries Borges inherited or built over the years, several titles merit special attention, particularly as many include personal observations, references, and even a concordance to bridge intended as well as published pages. That when it comes to Kabbalah, we don't possess a complete record of his consultations is evident by the fact that Gershom Shalom does not appear in that list. And he met with him twice and often referred to that. And also he doesn't mention Joshua Trachtenberg, Arthur Wade, and Henri Seruya. Of the 496 catalog titles, the following are authors with a direct bearing on our topic that he consulted to varying degrees and also wrote notations on the margins on them. The one already mentioned, Bishop, also Brand, Buber, Maurice Friedman, Nahum Glatzer, Henry Harry, Isaac Hussik, and Henry Millman. Awe is a common reader response to the breadth of motifs and topics that span Borges' works. He himself reflected on his journey from some obsessions to others in, for instance, Borges and I, The Sentinel, El Centinela, and Arte Poetica. If a limit were to be placed on his boundless curiosity, it would be around the games that reason plays on us. Every assertion and every belief is interrogated, every system put to the test of an internal coherence, which is ultimately the arbiter of logic and truth. The unanswerable falls to the timeless hope in the reader, the librarian, as it appears in La Biblioteca de Babel, who will identify the catalog of catalogs, the book that is the source of all. This is the notion that I believe brings Borges the closest to the sages who partake secrets from every trace of the sacred book. The last two paragraphs. In this sense, Death and the Compass, La Muerte y la Brújula, may be read as a parable, or a partial parable perhaps, of Borges' aesthetics. In a story steeped with Kabbalistic and other Jewish motifs, ostensibly aimed at uncovering the truth about the assassination that followed that of Rabbi Marcelo Yarmolinsky. If you wanted an Argentine Jewish name, that's it, Marcelo Yarmolinsky. A trap is set for a detective who, caught in a web of Jewish symbols and Kabbalistic allusions, fails to recognize the stratagem of the cunning labyrinth maker. And you referred to it, of course, this morning. When confronted at gunpoint, the detective, Longrot, cleverly suggests to Red Sallach, or Skarlach, who in setting his trap sought to avenge his brother's death and his own suffering at the detective's hands, that for their next meeting, a labyrinth consisting of a straight line would suffice. As we know from mathematics, that would have assured that they would never have met face to face, and he would have survived. An astute reader pointed out to me that in the dialogue between Longrot, the detective, and Red Skarlach, the gangster that will execute him, Borges built a multi-layered riddle for a quest that could have been solved in the linear tale. Here I note in passing the similarity of their names, victim and victimizer. They share a single set of options dancing around death. Regardless of which labyrinth was to be employed, and whether by chance as his own was, or by design, the end would have been, the end always is the same. But the search itself is what matters. This would have gone amiss with a different type of labyrinth. For the Kabbalist Borges traced, the search is clad in a cosmological mystery. For himself, it is clad in literature, a game to play as life races towards another ending, a reinterpreted beginning. Thank you.
אין לנו זמן, אבל אנחנו נעשה זמן לשתיים, שלוש שאלות.
Tiempo al tiempo.
בעברית אפשר?
נותנים זמן לזמן.
נותנים לזמן לזמן.
Solo una pregunta, ¿era judío Borges?
Lamentablemente él dice que no. לא. אם הוא היה יהודי, לא היה יהודי. הרבה... כן. שאלו המון פעמים, מה?
רצה להיות.
הוא רצה להיות. מצד האימא שלו, מצד הסבתא שלו היה אסבדו, אז יכול להיות שבאיזשהו שלב הוא כן היה, הוא בטח יהודי.
תקשיבו, היום מדברים על 60%, סטטיסטיקות האחרונות מדברות ש60% מדרום אמריקה על בסיס גנטי יהודים.
אפילו יהודים.
ובורכס, מה, צאצאי יהודים?
לא, זה כולל את היהודים. כן.
אפילו היהודים הם 60%. זה לא משנה.
אבל לא משנה, העיקר שאפשר לקרוא את הספרות שלו מנקודת ראות כזאת.
נפש יהודי. קבלה זה...
אפשר בעברית, כן? הזכרת את העניין הזה של התחלה וסוף, ראשית ואחרית, ואני חשבתי על קפקא בהקשר הזה, אולי להתחיל לחבר, כי כתבו הרבה על קפקא ובורכס. במחברות האוקטב, ו-The Blue Notebook, קפקא כותב באמת, אני התחלה או סוף, כן? Ich bin Anfang oder Ende. באיזה מובן אפשר לראות את זה גם בספרות, בפואטיקה של בורכס, והאם אפשר דרך זה לפרש את תפיסת הקבלה שלו?
I will answer either English or Spanish. Okay. You can follow that line. There is in fact a wonderful text by Borges called Kafka y sus precursores, in which what he says is that every major writer is creating the precursors. That we would not have known of many writers had it not been for a certain pinnacle of excellence. The same can be said of Borges, namely, thanks to him we are tracing that. There is an entire dialogue of that. It is not just by coincidence that Borges also translated the Metamorphosis into Spanish, but what he does always, the same thing as when he deals with the Kabbalah, he will get to it, he doesn't want to be caught or cornered into a single philosophical or literary system. So that's why he does the rhyme Sholem Golem, and that's why he also talks in one of the stories about the latrine that was spelled Kafka. Okay, so obviously that was a bad joke that he made, because the devotion that he had towards Kafka was very, very obvious, to the point of writing that Kafka y sus precursores. But yes, you definitely can trace a direct line there. Yes.
אם לא, אני אשאל אותך שאלה אחת שמעניינת אותי.
בבקשה.
מה עושה שם חתול?
של להסביר מה שמתכוון.
זה הטור של שולם, נכון? כאילו זה...
In the poem...
You can do it in English.
Okay, in the poem The Golem, he's talking about the ghetto, the Prague ghetto, and he says that there was a cat there. And this cat, of course, does not appear in Sholem. But he found it that it was necessary to create aesthetics for that poem. So, again, can you imagine a street without a cat?
No, this is not enough for me.
That is not enough for you?
No, of course there is streets, but
It has to be more,
it has to be more.
for instance?
I don't know, when you talk about Prague, about the metamorphosis, about the golem, about Sholem, about everything, so... And he mentioned a natural, that he told us that this is his imagination, yes, something about you know.
Well, let's put it. No, he says specifically.
He says specifically about it.
Este gato no está en Sholem. This cat is not in Sholem. Okay, he says so specifically. So he puts it in right there. Can you imagine a dog instead of a cat there?
אני רוצה, בגלל שכתבתי בעין החתול, אז אני אשתמש במומחיות שלי לחתולים. אז קודם כל בספר שלי בעין החתול גם אני מדברת, הקונוטציות הקבליות זה חתול וקליפת נוגה, שהוא השכחה בעצם. אז כאילו שם כתבתי את זה בכל עוד קודם, זה דבר אחד. אז, וזה כאילו מלא הקשרים, כי בגלל שהחתול הוא קליפת נוגה, הוא שכחה, הוא נרקיסיסטי, והוא כאילו אף פעם הוא לא נתפס וכולי, כמובן מאז לואיס קרול נשאר רק החיוך שלו. אז בעצם החתול הוא משהו שהמקמקות שלו, גם במטריקס, אנחנו רואים איך שבמטריקס, ברגע שהם רואים את החתול, אז הם מבינים שהם נמצאים בלבל אחר של מציאות. ומאז תראו שזה נכנס, זה כמעט הפך כרגע לתמה בסרט של המדע הבדיוני, שמעבר מהיר של חתול מסמן את זה שעברת לרובד אחר. וזה סתם אני אומרת. עכשיו, אני אגיד שתי דוגמאות נוספות מעניינות. הרמב"ם אומר שכשהרמב"ם באיזשהו טקסט שלו, שאני כרגע לא זוכרת אם זה במורה נבוכים או במקום אחר, או שרבי אברהם אומר את זה, שלפעמים אנשים מדמיינים שהם הגיעו לנבואה, הם מרוקנים את השכל ואת הכל, ומדמיינים שהם כבר מתקרבים לנבואה, ואז בעצם מסתבר שהם הסתגרו בבית עם חתול. ואז כשהם רואים את החתול, הם חושבים שזה התגלות. עכשיו, רבי נחמן מברסלב, בקטע שהתפרסם במעשיות הנוספות, שצבי מרק מפרסם במעשיות, אז הוא מפרסם, אומר שלפעמים בן אדם חושב שיש לו התגלות, ובעצם זה חתול ששורט את הדלת. עכשיו, זה ממש מרתק, בגלל שהרמב"ם הוא כאילו בסוג של הפשטה אינטרוברטית, ונחמן, ההתגלויות שלו הן אקסטרוברטיות. אז אצל הרמב"ם אתה נשארת עם חתול בפנים, אצל נחמן החתול שורץ על הדלת מבחוץ.
אצל בורג'ס הוא סתם מסתובב.
אבל עכשיו אולי הוא לא סתם מסתובב.
אולי לא סתם.
אולי יכול להיות שצריך להיות
יכול להיות.
הוא לא יודע אם לשרוד או להיכנס.
יכול להיות שצריך לחפור בגולם של מיירניק כדי לראות אם היה שם איזשהו אזכור תוך כדי התיאור הזה בפרק, כי כרגע אני לא זוכרת את זה טוב, אבל יכול להיות שיש שם אזכור. ודבר נוסף, בגלל ההרצאה הזאת התחלתי לחשוב, וגם בשעתה אמרת, שאולי היה איזשהו דם רק קטן בין בורגס לשולם, אבל זה רק עכשיו, פעם ראשונה חשבתי על זה. למה? כי בורגס היה יותר מדי רגיש, ולהגיד גולם שולם זה גם סוג של עקיצה, ושולם די מזלזל בו, ואומר מי זה בורגס. עכשיו, שני אנשים עם אגו, ואולי זה... שולם לא היה נדיב, לא לרוזנצוויג, לא לבובר ולא לוולטר בנימין. אז חוסר הנדיבות של שולם היא, במקרה, הכוונה הפרחון אינטלקטואלית, במקרה הזה הוא לא גבוה. אז יכול להיות ש...
יכול להיות שבורג'ס שמע משהו ממנו, ודווקא...
קצר טיפונת.
זה מוכיח שהוא ממש יהודי.